Good morning. This informational meeting of the House State Government Committee is called to order. And before we get started, I could ask everyone to please rise, and I would ask Representative Ryan, Colonel Ryan, to lead us in the pledge. Thank you, Representative Ryan. I could ask our member secretary, Representative Hill, to call the roll, please.
Chairman Metcalf.
Here.
Representatives Barrar on leave, Dush on leave, Grove. Hill here, Knowles. Miller on leave, Roy.
Here.
Ryan.
Here.
Saccone. Sankey.
Here.
Stats. Walsh. Ward.
Here.
Wieland.
Here.
Chairman Bradford. Representatives Bullock. Daly on leave, Delicio on leave, Dean on leave, Fitzgerald on leave, McCarter. Rabb. Sims.
Here.
Solomon.
On leave.
Vasquez.
Madam Secretary, we're joined by Chairman Bradford and Donna Bullock.
Thank you, Representative Sims.
Thank you, Representative Hill. We have a informational meeting this morning to discuss House Bill 482. It's Representative Roy's legislation. And before I recognize Representative Roy to introduce his legislation, the reason for the introduction of it, I'd like to welcome our guest today. We have Mr. Matthew Bembenek, he's Chief of Staff at DGS, and we have also Mr. Kenneth Hess, Deputy Secretary for Procurement. And thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thank you, Chairman.
And just a reminder to members, our guests are here to provide information, not to debate policy. They're here just for us to gather information and tap their expertise. So we do appreciate them being with us this morning. And with that, I'd like to recognize Representative Roy to introduce his legislation and the reasoning for the introduction of it. Representative Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, gentlemen, for coming today to the meeting. And thank you to the members for being here. This is the time of year we start having a lot of conflicting meetings, so I'm glad so many members of the committee were able to be here. But as we all know, the topic today is House Bill 482, which would basically eliminate the program that state legislators can be given a vehicle for their usage. The bill would eliminate that current program. Currently, members of the legislature can get a state lease vehicle as long as the lease payment is $628 a month or less. Again, this legislation would get rid of that. It's my understanding how the current system works. A legislator pays a proportional amount of the expenses. So if a legislator said that 90% of the mileage is business use, 10% is personal, they would only pay 10% or $62 of that $628 monthly lease. Same thing with the gas and maintenance, tires, repairs, everything else. Very expensive program. And under this legislation, vehicles that are currently in that program with legislators would stay in place. The way I wrote the legislation, when the leases expire, they would cease to exist. But it's my understanding, I learned later, that there's not really expiration dates on some of these leases. So I will be amending the legislation to basically make it say as soon as a member is done with a vehicle and they turn it back in, they can't get a new vehicle to replace that vehicle. So there's going to have to be a little bit of a tweak in the language. But anyways, we'll get into the more details a little bit later. But something else that we want to talk about today, too, is liability issues involved with, who owns a vehicle. The owner of a vehicle is responsible for what happens with that vehicle. So, there's potential negligent entrustment issues involved when people who may not have a very good driving record are assigned a state-owned vehicle. So I'm looking forward to all the information that you gentlemen will be able to provide us today.
Thank you, Representative Roy. And I don't think that our guests had any prepared remarks. Would you like to make any remarks at all before we start with possible questions? Or?
I think
we're ready to answer questions if you.
All right. Representative Roy, I recognize Representative Roy to start the question and answer.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, I recently just received a copy of this. I guess this is the agreement that's between the Department of General Services and the Pennsylvania House of Representatives.
Right.
Could you give kind of a Reader's Digest condensed version of what it basically says? It's about a 5 or 6 page document here.
What this basically is this is an agreement was entered into in 2012 between the legislature.
Is your microphone on there? And if you can pull a little bit closer just to
Sure.
for the audience.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Thank you.
Very good. So this interbranch agreement that you're referring to is a 2012 document that the General Assembly or that the House of Representatives entered into at that point in time, and it treats House members as what we consider agency heads, which basically allows a House member to be able to lease a vehicle from the Department of General Services, or to be assigned a vehicle from the Department of General Services. It binds them to the same criteria that any employee of the governor's under the governor's jurisdiction would have in terms of responsibility for driving the vehicle correctly. Gives DGS oversight of the vehicle, essentially, requires periodic maintenance, and spells out what the rental rates are for various vehicles in terms of price points.
Okay. Now, as far as I think the last numbers I saw, there are about 30 vehicles that House members have, or is that House members and senators combined?
Well, roughly, it's 39 vehicles in the House, of which 8 are pool vehicles.
Okay.
So 31 members have vehicles, and then the remainder are vehicles that you use for operational reasons, clerk's office, publications, printing, whatever you might use it for.
Okay. And then as far as I got into this a little bit during the budget hearings, but I'm on the Appropriations Committee also, but what type of screening is done by the Department of General Services regarding driving records? Like when a legislator, if I would ask for a state vehicle today, what kind of check is done of my driving history?
Anyone?
The operators have to certify that they have a valid operator's license, and that is the extent. The automotive officers, there's usually a person designated by every agency, and the House is no different, that monitors ongoing operations, and if there are accidents or changes in operator status, it's their responsibility to report that back up to the Bureau of Vehicle Management.
Now, at that initial stage, is a motor vehicle record obtained by DGS, or do you just take the word for it of the person getting the vehicle that they have a valid license?
At this point, we're taking their word for it. We don't have access to driver's records. To my knowledge, only PennDOT and the state police have access to that information.
Because a lot of times in employment situations, employers, they either require the employee to order a copy of their driving record and bring it to the employer, or if some kind of waiver is signed, the employer can order the motor vehicle record. But you guys don't do that currently.
No, I think that's more the case for professional drivers, if you will, that will get down to the detail for folks that are operating a vehicle as a part of their normal job responsibilities, as opposed to someone that uses a vehicle from time to time or occasionally.
Okay. And then as far as driving records go, if DGS becomes aware that a legislator, has speeding tickets or, stop sign violations, anything like that, are vehicles revoked from legislators?
Of course, like anything else, it depends on the severity.
Right.
But yeah, we will engage with the agency. It's really the agency's responsibility. They have supervisory and human resource responsibilities over their employees, but we'll confer with them as to what the appropriate level of corrective action or discipline is.
Okay. And then how would the driving records how would that information be obtained? It would be up to the individual agency. Like in the case of the State House, it would be like if they wanted to get driving records every year, that's something the chief clerk's office would do rather than
Well, I think
the
they'd
new
have
folks?
to request it through either through PennDOT or through the police, but yeah.
Okay. As far as, from your experience, how many vehicles approximately does the state have, not just for all the different agencies, approximately?
14,000.
14,000.
Give or take.
And then that number, I think Governor Corbett was trying to reduce the number of state vehicles, and I can't remember. Do you remember what those numbers were?
If I recall, I think there was a 5-year trend where the number of state vehicles was reduced about 3,000, give or take.
So it had been then like 17,000 or something, and he reduced it to 14,000. What's the result of that been? Have you been able to gauge how much money that has saved, or is that spread out among all the agencies so it doesn't really impact what you guys do?
That's correct. It's spread out over the using agencies because they, by and large, pay for the use of the vehicles.
Okay. Now, have you guys in the Department of General Services done any type of analysis ever? I think there's a sweet spot where it might be cheaper to provide somebody with a vehicle. If somebody's only driving 1,000 miles a year, to spend $7,000, to lease a vehicle, and they only drive 1,000 business miles a year, that doesn't make sense. But if a person's driving, 30,000 miles a year, it makes sense. Where's the sweet spot usually?
Typically, I'll answer the question in this manner. A DGS pool vehicle, we look at, and this varies with the price of fuel.
Right,
okay?
right.
But for this comparison that we did, we were using, at the time, the fuel price was $2.14 a gallon. It was costing us 25 cents a mile to operate DGS pool vehicles. An enterprise rent-a-car was 37.7 cents a mile, and of course, the IRS personal reimbursement rate for mileage, 53.5 cents a mile. So agency DGS pool vehicles were by far the most cost-effective means for travel.
So on an individual level, if a legislator is driving 20 or 25,000 miles a year with a state lease vehicle, that can probably be, economical. But if a legislator is only driving, 5,000 miles a year, they could have been paid, $2,500 in mileage rather than $7,000 to lease a vehicle. So does DGS work with the different agencies to help them, hey, this person should be using their own car, this person here should be getting an assigned vehicle? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Twice a year, we do a utilization review, and so we look at the usage of vehicles. Generally speaking, we want to see 1,000 miles per month of utilization or more, and oftentimes we'll engage with agencies that maybe have spiky use, like the Department of Revenue might have way more driving in audit and tax season, if you will, and we'll move vehicles around from agency to agency to get the utilization up.
Because I'm looking at this report here. I think you guys might have provided this report. I'm not sure. Because there's vehicles on here for the legislature. There's one that's been in service for 5 months, but there's only 2,042 miles in the vehicle. So that's only 400 miles a month or something like that. There's another one. Where did I see it on here? It's been in place for 49 months, and there's only 17,000 miles. So what's 49 months? That's like 4 years.
That's correct.
So 17, that's like not even 5,000 miles a year. So in those situations, it would probably be more economical for those legislators to just get paid mileage.
Right. I'm not sure of the specific vehicles. Most times when I hear something like 17,000 miles in 4 years, mostly that's like a city service vehicle that's making deliveries for print shops or things like that.
Oh, okay.
So the vehicle is being driven a lot, which is another one of our ways of looking at things. We look at mileage as one criteria, and the other criteria is the time in service. So if you're driving it 17 out of 20 working days a month, that counts as an efficiently utilized vehicle or sufficiently utilized vehicle.
Okay. And now, across different agencies, people who have a vehicle for work to drive to meetings and go on appointments and stuff like that, is it typical? I don't think it is. I'm going to ask: is it typical to be able to get a vehicle up to $628 a month lease, or are they usually more modest vehicles than that? Like say somebody was working for the Department of Agriculture and they were driving around inspecting, restaurants, or if a person worked for the Department of Human Services and they drove around, they inspected nursing homes, that they have to have a vehicle and they drive enough where it makes sense to have a company-owned vehicle, state-owned vehicle rather than their own. What types of limits are usually on those vehicles as far as the monthly lease payment?
The average lease payment across all the agencies and all the vehicle types is around $353. I think that's based on last fiscal. So.
Okay.
So that's typically what you would consider to be your smaller or mid-sized car.
Right.
Representative Roy, we do have a few other members that have some questions.
I'm sorry. I get a little carried away sometimes, so I appreciate it. Just one last comment, if I could. It looks like our vehicle's cost is way higher than that, because I'm looking at the spreadsheet here, and almost all of ours in the State House, there's $628 a month, $586, $419, $419. So it looks like we're a lot on the heavy side. But I will stop my line of questioning so other members can ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Roy. Before we continue with questions, I'd like to recognize Representative Ryan, who has a guest with him today they'd like to introduce.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. We have Kyle Rivers is joining me today. He's a student at York College, and he spends time with his grandmother in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and his grandmother and my wife work together, so don't believe anything you hear. Kyle, welcome.
Welcome to our meeting. Representative Whelan.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for being here and providing us with some information. In my previous life, I was a county commissioner, and we, towards the end of my second term, we were implementing the newer technologies where you would place GPS tracking and monitoring. These vehicles for the House, the Senate, and any department, do they have GPS tracking and monitoring systems on them?
We are currently in the process of rolling out our telematics program. As of the end of last month, we had telematics installed in about 1,500 vehicles. Our target population is around 6,000 vehicles. Generally speaking, we are intending to put all the vehicles put telematics devices in all the vehicles under DGS control, so all of our lease fleet vehicles. There are still many vehicles that are special fund vehicles that the agencies control. Usually, my understanding is the federal monies may have purchased those vehicles, and those are not necessarily subject to our processes. So we're asking those agencies to participate, but it's not necessarily mandatory. The other big exception would be pursuit vehicles for law enforcement. For the most part, they're already equipped with laptops that have GPS tracking, and so most of the functionality of telematics would be redundant.
For the folks in the audience and perhaps on TV, could you explain in layman's terms what abilities that gives you on those vehicles?
I'd be happy to. So this is a device that provides GPS location of the vehicle. Mostly, however, fleets, for example, big UPS, folks like that, use it for driver safety is the number one usage. Secondarily, they're trying to improve their fleet mileage and utilization. For example, we can ascertain, Idle time is a good, like trucks that are making deliveries, we can see whether the driver would be shutting his vehicle down when he's making his stops or not. And we can try to address that kind of behavior and in an attempt to increase the fuel economy of the fleet. We did a pilot of 60 vehicles before we began this big rollout. And in one case, what we found was that the telematics device returns diagnostic information about the vehicle. So we were being told that this vehicle was overheating. When we asked the driver, do you have a service engine light, they reported no. So we instructed them to take the vehicle to a dealer for analysis, and the dealer reported that indeed that there was that a fan had failed, an electric fan had failed, but the service engine light did not trip. So we don't necessarily, well, we have no control over the software that's embedded in the vehicle and the control system and when the lights come on and when they don't, but we probably saved a $5,000 repair and stranding a Commonwealth employee somewhere due to an overheated vehicle.
And what about speed? Does it monitor speed if you can pick up
Yep, sure
a
does.
Commonwealth vehicle that's exceeding the speed limit by certain criteria that you place in your? Okay.
Yep,
Thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Thank you, Representative Wheeler. And Representative Rabb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was curious how all electric vehicles might change this spreadsheet and this program.
Well, we are trying to roll out more and more electric vehicles into the fleet. I think you'll have noticed some of them around. We have some Bolts, some Volts, some Fusions. Probably the biggest thing I would say, I personally have a hybrid vehicle. The fleet manager has a personal hybrid vehicle. And we've been looking at the economics of, as you're probably well aware, there's a significant cost increase for especially full-on plug-in hybrid or plug-in electric vehicles. In fact, I won't mention any models, but in a demo where we had a vehicle for some time, we did the cost analysis, and setting aside the cost of the infrastructure for charging, but taking into account the electrical consumption, the payback, the break-even would have been 750,000 miles. So clearly we're not there yet. But we are, where it makes sense, trying to put more and more vehicles in the fleet. And I think you'll see more vehicles like the Malibu hybrid that does not require the charging infrastructure, but takes advantage of the onboard battery and self-regeneration. That's a really good, has a much better break-even point than a full electric at this point.
Thank you, Representative Rabb. Representative Ryan?
I had a Volvo once with 750,000 miles on it, so I might be
Brats.
a candidate for that. I gave it to my son afterwards, and he was not impressed with my generosity. I just have a couple questions. I come out of the private sector. When we would look at these types of things, we would do the same type of analysis, how many miles are being driven. And there would be some cases in which people are getting paid mileage reimbursement for which they, in fact, should probably have a leased vehicle. Have you done any of that type of analytics?
Yes, we have.
And have you, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, are there cases where it makes more sense to lease than to provide mileage?
I can't speak to individual agencies, House, Senate, PennDOT, Revenue, et cetera. There are situations like that do occur, and as we catch them, we address it. What makes it difficult is that we don't see the personal mileage reimbursement. That doesn't go through the Bureau of Vehicle Management. So it's much harder for us to detect that kind of situation.
And I'm not an attorney, but someone who's an attorney may already know this answer. If the person has a state vehicle and they're in an automobile accident, does the state provide the insurance for that? And does that increase the average amount of settlement that may actually take place than if it were, say, a private insured vehicle?
I can answer a part of it.
Okay.
I may be able to answer
Go
the remainder of
for it.
So with the state program, if you're driving a state vehicle, there's a program called ALSIP, which is under the Bureau of Risk and Insurance Management within DGS. It provides basic coverage up to certain limits. I believe it's a $5,000 initial an initial tort claim. This is where it sort of gets into the specifics. Back several years ago, there was a Tort Reform Act, so it basically aligned our payouts with what the industry standard is in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And then once the industry standard is met, if there's additional cost, then what we do is you're able to look at your private insurance on your side if there are additional costs or other insurance coverage that may be in your family, et cetera. So the state is only is only required for an initial payment. If it's anything beyond that initial payment, then they look to your private insurance.
Thank you very much. There's significant income tax implications for personal use of a leased vehicle. Do you work with the comptroller of the House and the controller of the Senate to provide that type of an analytics annually to make sure that that's being properly reflected on W-2s and things of that nature?
We try to, yes. We
Do you have an average amount of use of personal use for vehicles? Because that's usually what the IRS will look at is if someone's driven 20,000 miles in a year and you say you've had 5 miles of personal use, they're going to raise a flag and indicate that's not normal.
Yeah.
So do you do any type of analytics like that?
The STD 554 forms don't routinely flow through us. Those are, again,
Okay.
each agency is responsible for their own drivers and operations. But interestingly, one of the things that we're attempting to do is to piggyback on the technology of the telematics device
Okay.
by installing a commute usage button in vehicles so that if a vehicle is permanently assigned to you and you are leaving your house and it's personal use, it's just your commute to get to work, push the button when you leave and when you arrive, and then let's say at 10 o'clock you go out making deliveries or whatever business usage you have. The system will be able to differentiate between commute usage and business usage, and so we will be able to affect the productivity of every permanently assigned vehicle and the driver in the Commonwealth. That the intent is they won't have to fill out that form any longer. It'll actually be tracked digitally.
Just so you're aware, in the CPA ethics world, we changed our standards on December 15, 2015, so that government employees and individuals who are in business, and this came up, I was chair of the ethics committee of the PICPA for a year and on the committee for 4. And if we knowingly have a failure where there's not a connectivity between two agencies of information that's being provided about a potential taxable event, the CPA involved can actually get disciplined and held liable for it. So I encourage, I bring this up every time I can. So we had a case in the Commonwealth where a person was told by their supervisor that the Commonwealth is not subjected to the Internal Revenue Service rules and regulations, and I can tell you for a fact that's just not so. And the IRS, and if you don't agree with me on that, I'll give you the name of the person. He'll tell you. But I would encourage you that if you see a weakness like that, you probably ought to follow through on that, and I'm sure the chair would be willing to assist. The last question I have is on the mileage cost of 25 cents a mile. As a CPA, that seems like a really low number, and I've seen it. Does that include the cost of insurance?
Yeah, yeah. That's
And are you doing that on a self-insurance rate, or are you based upon
Self-insurance rate.
Okay, so you've had accident rates below normal then.
Yes.
If you have a catastrophic event, does that then get factored into a following year?
Should get factored in the following year.
Okay. And does it include depreciation on the vehicle?
Yes.
It does. Can you get me a no?
Well, there's a very significant advantage to operating Commonwealth vehicles. I mean, as a large fleet, we have a pretty decent purchase price advantage. Fuel, we don't, of course, pay federal or state tax, which we all know is a pretty good chunk. Self-insured. Our maintenance costs, we are within DGS, we are certified warranty shops for General Motors and Ford, and we're working on our Chrysler certification. And so every aspect, buying parts, we're trying to economize in every facet of it. So
Representative Rabb would be disappointed if I didn't say this. On the GM vehicles, do you add in the factored amount of the forgiveness of indebtedness that took place when they went bankrupt? I'm kidding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Ryan. Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today, gentlemen. If I could follow up on some of the questions that Representative Ryan asked in much less technical CPA terms. One of the things that we hear from constituents often is that they raise questions regarding personal and political use of state-owned vehicles. Can you talk about the process now for personal and political use? You know, there have been a lot of reforms that have been taking place here in this building with regard to the use of taxpayer resources for political purposes. So can you talk about how that's addressed currently under the state program?
I'll do my best. It's really not DGS's purview to police each individual agency and to assess what the purposes for vehicle operation are. So we have a network of automotive officers that we rely on to as conduits to pass information both up and down regarding safe operation of the vehicles, who they're assigned to, accidents, maintenance, et cetera. But when it comes to personal versus political versus business use, that's really up to each individual agency and or chamber to police.
So we would have to talk to the caucuses that allow for their members to use state-owned vehicles as to how they handle it.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, if I might, is that something that this committee would be able to look into?
We could certainly ask.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Hill. Representative Bradford.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to thank the gentlemen for their insights. One of the things, and I say this as a person who drives my personal vehicle, but one of the things Representative Roy had thrown out was kind of the month-to-month costs for the lease vehicles, for the fleet vehicles, and they obviously range in the $400 or $500, I think even $600 range. Mm-hmm. And again, and this isn't to pick out individuals. The first member I picked out, though, had their expenses online, and God bless them for having that, so I could just kind of see, to your point about having to go to the chief clerk and stuff. And I see some mileage reimbursements that on a monthly basis are well in excess of $1,000. There's no fleet vehicle, kind of to the point Representative Ryan had, that has that type of mileage expense. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say so.
That's fair, yeah.
Yeah, and again, I think that goes to really the point Representative Hill makes. And again, one can make the political fight, whether it's appropriate for legislators to have fleet vehicles. And I think, unfortunately, the politics may cloud the economics of it. And I think Representative Ryan, I was shocked, to be honest, how low your operating cost is per mile. I think it's important to keep some clarity to it. I realize the politics of this issue have a distorting factor, and again, that's a political issue that really is outside of this building. But I think it's important to look at what these costs are for mileage reimbursement. It's not free, and it's also taxpayer money that's being expended. And again, I'm someone who, full disclosure, I have personal vehicle and submit for mileage. So mileage is not free, and in some cases, it looks like the numbers would actually dictate a fleet vehicle may be the appropriate, at least from an economic standpoint, the way to go. One of the other issues Representative Roy raised, and I think he's right to raise, is the issue of liability and how that plays out with a fleet vehicle. And obviously there's a cost to that. There's an exposure there that is real. One of the issues I was wondering, and again, I was thinking this and not selfishly, but Is there exposure to having, even though it's a personal vehicle, having individuals within the scope of their employment driving a personal vehicle? I would assume a not too creative plaintiff's attorney could include the Commonwealth as a litigant in an issue where there's liability. Do you know if the Commonwealth has been included in litigation where a personal vehicle was involved because it was within the scope of employment?
Not to my knowledge.
Might be a question better posed to your attorneys, I wonder.
Yeah, we could certainly look into that and follow up.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because I do wonder, you know, with kind of encouraging, because of the political dynamic, again, not because of the economic, about using personal vehicles, I wonder if there's an exposure there that we haven't really discussed in terms of what that cost is. You know, I got to think our personal insurers would only be too happy to hand over the Commonwealth as the available deep pocket in case of a catastrophic payout.
One would think.
So with that, I realize I don't have a lot of questions there, but I think there's some points that provide a little bit of context and light where some might be necessary. So thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Bradford. In addition to if a legislator would have one of the monthly lease rates of $628, is fuel included in that cost?
We hand out a fuel card that, but yes, we end up then, you know, the cost of the fuel comes to us.
So if a legislator is getting...
Oh, and I'm sorry. You're talking about one of our leased vehicles, not a third-party leased vehicle. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay, I'm sorry. For our vehicles, you're given a fleet card, but the charges come back separately for fuel usage.
So the charges come back to the House of Representatives and the Senate
Right,
for
that's
fuel.
correct,
So
yes.
the fuel cost would be added in on top of
The lease rate.
the lease rate for the operational costs.
Right.
How about the maintenance for those vehicles? Do those
Maintenance
maintenance...
is in the lease. That's
Okay.
correct, yes.
And that would not be borne by either chamber, but it would be borne by DGS then?
The using agency pays the lease cost.
Right.
So yes, the maintenance is part of the lease.
So you're going to get new tires on a state-leased vehicle, a House member, and the new tires are going to be covered in the cost of the lease?
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Representative Knowles.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I do apologize. I came in late. I was at another meeting, and I understand the question, which I will find the answer out, is to deals with the process that's used in assigning a vehicle to a state legislator or a full-time employee. I guess my question is, we're all human. We all make mistakes. And if indeed an employee or a legislator, particularly where in a situation where their license was suspended, do they have an obligation to report that to you, or is there some kind of follow-up that you check periodically to be certain that they are still indeed a licensed driver? Is there anything in place to deal with that situation?
Yeah, the management directive for vehicle operation indicates that operators of state vehicles must maintain their qualifications. So, you know, PennDOT CDL, you know, operating a dump truck. If he was to lose his CDL, he has to.
Well, what if he doesn't, or what if she doesn't?
Mm-hmm. I think in those cases, typically, when we do find out, then you know, there's appropriate action taken by the agency. But again, DGS does not have access to motor vehicle driver's records.
Okay, but you can take appropriate action if it involves a state employee. What if it's a member of the administration, or what if it's a state legislator?
Well, that'll be up to that body to deal with.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Grove.
Thank you, Chairman. I know the underlying bill covers members of the General Assembly, but what about the judiciary? Do they get state lease vehicles as well, the elected judges and the personnel, AOPC?
They currently are kind of a mixed bag. They have some of both.
Some of both, okay. Do typically the justices and the appellate courts, do they normally take lease vehicles, or Do they normally have their own vehicle?
I think there's more that have their own vehicles than have DGS leased vehicles.
Okay. Can we get a similar breakdown on the judiciary? I don't know if you gave this out, but is it possible to get a breakout of the judiciary as well?
I guess we could ask them if they're willing to share their information with you.
Okay. That'd be great. And then for those justices that don't know, now my understanding is you don't see the reimbursement for private.
That's correct.
Like those reimbursements. I was just reading, familiar with the caucus. They did a little bit of dive into judiciary's finances, and a couple of justices were expensing AAA memberships and stuff like that. I mean, I don't know if that. I'm hopeful that as far as the General Assembly goes, that's not a normal practice for us. I assume at the state government level with the executive offices, that's definitely a no-no. But okay, I know you can't answer those questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Grove. I was just asking my executive director if, which I would think the answer would be yes, but I would think that that information will be available under right to know for even the courts. As far as you're maintaining a list of how many vehicles they might have, I would assume that should be
Likely,
pretty
yeah.
basic information citizens should have access to, whether the judges want us to or not. I know they opt themselves out of a lot of laws, like being able to hire their own family members, but immediate family members that they opted themselves out of. Representative Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was looking at the list that we have, the spreadsheet here, and of the 30 vehicles, it looks like there's 20, for the legislators, the vehicles that are assigned to individual legislators, there are 21 SUVs, 8 cars, and 1 minivan. Is that typical for like a office worker kind of, like if you had 30 office workers that, or people that, go out and inspect nursing homes, all they're taking with them is a briefcase, maybe some paperwork. Would they generally have sport utility vehicles, or would they have cars usually?
Well, I think it generally depends upon where they're operating in the state. A lot of the agencies that operate north of Interstate 80 opt for all-wheel drive vehicles, I think understandably so. And then some agencies that deliver goods, like an example that comes to mind is PLCB, that haul around signage and gizmos that promote the use of lottery and make deliveries to retailers. Then they typically have specified vehicles with greater cargo capability.
It's my understanding that most of the vehicles that state legislators have, they're mostly in the southeast, Philadelphia, Chester, Montgomery. So normally a lot of just the employee plus their briefcase making calls in that southeast part of the state where there's not nearly as much snow. That would normally be regular cars rather than the more expensive four-wheel drive SUVs.
Well, it's really up to the agency or to the automotive officer at each customer location to specify the class of vehicle for the use.
I mean, in this case, with the specific inter-branch agreement that you referenced earlier, that sort of has opened up the legislature to, we provide a variety of vehicles, and so you're basically picking from a list of vehicles that are purchased by the Commonwealth. Right. So if you wanted to change the types of vehicles that the legislators are using, that would have to be a discussion amongst the caucuses as to what types of vehicles, if you want to limit it to a certain category of vehicle.
Okay. And then I have a follow-up question to another question that was asked earlier. Recently there was a situation where, there was a state house member that had a suspended driver's license driving a, state lease vehicle through this program. They were involved in a hit-and-run accident, and it was discovered that the legislator had a suspended driver's license. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but that's a really scary situation. Like, thank goodness, I think it was a fairly minor accident, but had that been a serious accident, with a, negligent entrustment issue, if an entity owns a vehicle and that entity knows, or they should have known, that the driver either had a bad driving record or did not have a driver's license, and then that employee, that driver, has a claim where somebody is injured or property is damaged, it's a negligent entrustment issue. And, lawyers love those because they can tell the jury, hey, the boss, knew this person didn't have a driver's license. They let him drive a car anyways. How big of a check should they have to write to the person suing? What do you think? Do you have any recommendations of what the House could do to make sure, we never have a situation like that again?
Take it. Well, I can tell you this, that the number of incidents of accidents is really remarkably low. I have data from 2014 to current, and there were,
12 accidents in 2017,
Right.
8 accidents in 2016, 15 accidents in 2015, and 1 accident in 2014. To echo what I think you were going to say, the vast majority of these are, small fender bender type things.
That's for the you mean just for legislative vehicles?
Legislative vehicles.
just the House.
Just for the House. And, okay, so there's about 30 vehicles and 12 accidents a year. So that's like almost half of the vehicles are in accidents. I mean, that seems like a lot. Is that lower than the normal accident rate?
Well, I think what we're looking at is, is it an accident that was initiated by the legislator, or was it, chance that someone, a private party,
More
caused the
than
accident?
half of the vehicles were not the fault of the Commonwealth operator.
Oh, okay.
All right. So a vehicle could be sitting in a parking lot and get hit, and those are recorded as accidents for us.
Okay. So, all right. Well, thank you for your questions or answers. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank you, Representative Roy. Representative Knowles, did you still have a question? Or?
Just a follow-up statement, if I may, Mr. Chairman. We in the General Assembly boast about transparency and everybody being treated the same. And this isn't directed at you, gentlemen, but there needs to be some kind of there needs to be something out there that will prevent any situation from continuing to drive a state vehicle if indeed their license is suspended or if there are other situations where they shouldn't be driving it. And just regardless as to whether it be a member of the judiciary, a member of the General Assembly, a member of the administration, there needs to be some kind of a vehicle in place, whether it's us in-house in our caucuses or whether it's in the administration. It's obvious to me that there really is nothing in place that would prevent the situation that Representative Roy described. Can you comment on that?
I think we're taking steps now to provide access or a path for us to get some sort of updates. But that's working.
Can you provide that to this committee when you come up with the final product and how that's being done?
Yep, certainly.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Knowles. Looks like that's all they have. All the members that wanted to be recognized to ask questions or make comments while you two are with us, we appreciate both of you making time to spend time with the State Government Committee this morning. Thanks for entertaining our questions and sharing your expertise with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Both have a good day.
You too.
For the members, we plan on holding a voting meeting sometime later today to be called off the floor. You were given notice last week of a couple pieces of legislation to expect at that meeting. So we still plan on calling that meeting off the floor. So if you can keep an ear out for the next meeting that we plan on having today, would appreciate it. Representative Roy motions to adjourn, second by Representative Ward. This meeting's adjourned.
Exactly.